So tonight's shir is sponsored by Mike and Marsha Turtel. It's to commemorate the yahrzeit of Mike's mother, Tzipra Ruchel Bas Avram Eliezer Turteltau. The yahrzeit, if I'm not mistaken, was the 9th, which was a day and a half ago. So thank you so much, Mike. Thank you so much, Marsha. May the neshama have an aliyah from our words of Torah, and hopefully we'll gain a little bit of Torah knowledge in our discussion today. Now, we're going to be talking a little bit about brachos. Right? We make brachos to express our gratitude to the Almighty for the magnificent flavors and sustenance that we get from food. And we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of being specific with our gratitude. I think we all understand that when something is done for us and we want to say thank you, a generic thank you is nice, but it is far better if you can be specific, right? Thank you so much for making the magnificent dinner. And the more specific we are with expressing our gratitude, the more value it has. That's something that is clear. So we're going to talk a little bit about brachos and being specific. But beforehand, I'd like to point out, we Jewish people, and again, I love Jewish people. They're very, very special, and some of my best friends are Jews. We really are on the cutting edge of foods. What do I mean by that? Some people think that the Yiddish mention only eat traditional foods, right? And there are many people that believe that if you want to be a Heilige Yid, if you want to be a holy Jew, it means to eat the egg and onion as they did in Europe, and the herring as they did in Europe. And that seems to be an attitude by some, and they find the spiritual insight and gematria that relates to the herring and to the kigel and all the traditional foods. And in no way am I minimizing it, because for some, that is a way of connecting to tradition. And minhagim are really the glue that keep our Judaism alive. But at the same time, I really think that new things that we enjoy will become part of the Jewish palate. I have no doubt that in 100 years from now, there's going to be gematriot and spiritual explanations to sushi. In other words, there's going to be a belief that sushi is a Yiddish meichel. And the reason is because you do find sushi now at Jewish weddings. It's becoming very much a Jewish food. You can't go, you want a real a Yiddish experience, you want to go ahead and really celebrate, there got to be sushi. So we tap into the latest and we enjoy it and we make it really in some ways ours. Now, how can I prove that to you, that we don't only focus on the old, but we even enjoy the latest? So we're going to talk a little bit about tea. Tea became more popular in the 17th, 18th century. It really became, the beverage that symbolizes globalization, that you could enjoy a hot beverage that originated in China. And for the Jewish people, tea became very important. And the way I know it is that there is a tremendous amount of discussion from authorities in the early 18th century how to have your hot tea on Shabbos. There is an issue called bishul, cooking, and we obviously have to be sensitive to the laws of Shabbos, but at the same time, we want to enjoy a hot tea. So there's a lot of literature about how to be sure that you have your tea and at the same time, not violate the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos. So what we're going to start off today, due to the fact that our discussion relates to brachos, to brachot, we're going to start off about a discussion that relates to the bracha on tea. And it was a big to-do. It was a storm in a teacup, or perhaps a tempest in a teacup, that related to the bracha on tea. And it all starts off that there was a great rabbi, Rabbi Meir Eisenstadt, and he's the author of Responsa Panim Meirot, extremely popular due to the fact that he was a tremendous scholar and his writings are impressive. They're very glatt. In other words, they're very logical. He sticks to his point and he's very, very convincing in making his point. And in one of his responses, he shares with us that the following: I know that people make a shehakol niya bidvaro on their tea. However, although I follow that practice as well, in reality, I think it should be a bore pri ha'adama. Okay, that's what he writes in his Chelek Aleph in the first edition of his responsa. A contemporary of his, Rabbi Yaakov Reischer, the author of Responsa Shvut Yaakov, another great Torah scholar. He was in Prague earlier on, moved on to other cities later on. And he responds that that's not the case. It's a shahakol without doubt, meaning don't just claim that it's a minhag olam, that it's a custom that many have, and I'm going to just follow the custom, even though I think otherwise. In reality, it is a boreh pri. In reality, no question, it is a shakol niabidvaro. So in edition number 2 of Panim Meirot, Rabbi Meir Eisenstadt says, let me share with you a story. And he says that when I lived in the city of Worms, I traveled through Frankfurt. And in Frankfurt at that time, there was a great Rosh Yeshiva. There was a big Rosh Yeshiva in the German community of Frankfurt. And the name of this Rosh Yeshiva, it's not a very well-known name, but nevertheless, he had a very, very significant impact in the beginning of the 18th century. The name of this Rosh Yeshiva was Rabbi Shmuel Shoten. Rabbi Shmuel Shoten led a yeshiva. His great-grandson was actually the Chatam Sofer, so it indicates that it's a family with great knowledge in Torah. So shares with us Rabbi Meir. I was visiting Rabbi Shoten, and he was drinking a cup of tea, and you won't believe it, he made a bracha of boreh pri ha'adama. And we're soon going to discuss the technicalities. Why would you make a boreh pri ha'adama on a glass of tea? And I turned to Rabbi Shoten, and I said, Rabbi, perhaps you are technically right, but if the whole Jewish world is making a shahakol, why are you different? Is there not a minhag here? And Rabbi Shoten responds that you should know that the concept of minhag can only come from people that have knowledge, from scholars, from chachamim. When it is lo al pi chachamim, when a minhag is just done by the masses who don't focus on Torah scholarship, it doesn't impress me. This is what the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Shoten, said to Rabbi Meir Eisenstadt. Now, I see it as interesting. You know, a lot of scholars write how in the past, the 2 centuries, yeshivas became detached from the masses, from the balabatim. And as a result, sometimes halachic guidance that comes forth from a yeshiva might be a little bit of a standard that is too high for the masses. This is something that scholars like focusing on, and perhaps even when we had our discussion about the Erev in Toronto, it relates to it, that it used to be what the scholars are arguing, that if you go back 250 years ago, the rabbi in town was also the head of the local small yeshiva. So his psak, his halachic guidance was always very practical because he knew what the masses are doing, and it was basically on the same track. As yeshivot became independent institutions from the rabbinate, there's this divide in the Jewish world. This is what's argued by scholars. I see from this Rabbi Shoten psak that goes back to the early 18th century, that already in those days, you could have a Rosh Yeshiva that claims, listen, for me, when you tell me minhag, it has to be of people within the system of scholarship. So this is just on the side, because our main focus is the cup of tea. And the question is going to be, why would someone argue to make a boreh pri adama on basically water that is flavored? Okay, so this is the question that we're going to go ahead and try to address. And we're going to analyze it very soon, starting off with Talmudic literature, to try to appreciate why the Panim Me'irot believed, and also why Rabbi Schoten actually had such a practice. Now, I started off by mentioning there's a virtue in being specific with your brachot. In other words, you know that technically speaking, if let's say something is placed in front of me and I have absolutely no idea what bracha it is, I have no idea. I don't know how it's made. I don't know how it's processed. I don't know what ingredients are in it. So technically speaking, a person can just make a shehakol neya bidvaro baruch ata Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shehakol neya bidvaro, and mission accomplished. Because shehakol neya bidvaro is like that generic blessing that technically speaking works for everything. But the ideal is to do your research. The ideal is to know, is this fruit of the land or is it fruit of the tree? Does it have grain in it? Does it not? Is the grain that is mixed in, is it there for flavor or perhaps only as a binding agent? And it is important to know where things come from. This is just a general true idea that research is required to be a good Jew. You have to know where things come from. Show you a story, it doesn't relate to it, but I think it makes this point. Before you utter something, know where it comes from. You know, when I was 13, I had a bar mitzvah and I got a few gifts. One of the gifts I got was a set of chess, and it was a very fancy one because it came in a small briefcase. You would open the briefcase, take out the board, take out the nice wooden pieces, and I really, really loved it. But what I liked about it even more was the briefcase itself, because it wasn't a large one, it was leather, it closed well. And I realized a few days after my bar mitzvah that the few things that I need to take to school at the time would fit into it. And I felt I would look very, very cool walking into my Talmud Torah Sanhedrin in Jerusalem with my little leather briefcase. So I remember this, I remember such details. And I walk in with a big smile and I'm greeted by, I think it was the principal and my teacher. Now this was a Haredi school. Rabbi Fleischer, I remember still the name of the Rabbi Fleischman, perhaps, and I don't remember his name exactly, but he was a fine Rebbe, a nice long beard. I don't know if you were Shalmi, I don't know if it was exactly a Chassid, but a Haredi Jew for sure. And standing next to me was also the principal, another nice Haredi Jew. And they look at the briefcase and they say with a smile the following, I'll never forget it. Ah, bata hayom im ha James Bond shelcha. You arrived today with your James Bond. Now, for whatever reason, they associated my leather briefcase with James Bond. I don't know, maybe Olav Hashem Sean Connery would carry it in the early days. Ich weiß nicht. And for me, later on, you know, and perhaps even at that time, I was, you know, think about it. These Hasidic, these very, very frum Yidden talking about James Bond, if they would know everything about James Bond, they would be shaken, if not stirred, from what they uttered, right? Lesson is, know where things come from before you utter them, okay? That's the lesson that I want to get to. And we're going to have to start off with actually learning Talmudic literature to appreciate this early discussion that related to our tea. Now, our ancestors lived in Babylonia. And our ancestors in Babylonia, they were great Torah scholars, but they lived in a society that had specific foods and specific recipes. I sometimes feel that it's chaval, it's sad that we don't have a tradition of what those specific foods are, because we would understand Talmud better. And what do I mean by that? There's a discussion in the Talmud about something called trima. It is Tet, Resh, Yud, Mem, Aleph. And when you study the Talmud, you realize that there's no question that this is some kind of dish that is made out of dates. Dates were extremely popular in Babylonia. And the Talmud asks, what bracha do I make on trima? Is it still boreh pri ha'etz due to the fact that it comes from dates? Or perhaps due to the fact that it is processed, it is now a shahakol niyabid varo. That's the discussion the Talmud has regarding trima. Now, what exactly is trima? So there's a debate and a discussion. So Rashi shares with us the following. It is some kind of processed dates, but they are crushed not completely. They still retain a little bit of the texture of a date. Due to the fact that they still retain the texture of date, and when you look at that date paste, you could sense that these are dates. You could still see perhaps the clumpiness of a date. It retains the earlier bracha of boreh peri ha'etz. Okay, this is what we are told. And that, by the way, is a clear indication that if it would completely lose its form, if let's say they would have a blender and they would throw dates into the blender and it would become a puree that no longer retains any of the texture of the date, or something far more practical today, peanut butter, right? Where at home we enjoy good natural peanut butter. So there are two types of peanut butters. There is the smooth and there's the chunky one. And there is a major difference halachically regarding the bracha. Your chunky peanut butter, due to the fact that there are pieces of peanuts in it, so it retains its original bracha of boreh pri adama, and that's what you're going to make on such a peanut butter. The smooth peanut butter loses its original bracha due to the fact that the texture is no longer identifiable, even though I know it's from peanuts. But the fact is, by just looking at it, you don't relate it automatically if you would not have the background knowledge to peanuts. It is a shakol niyabid varo. Okay, so the trima of the Talmud became a major discussion, and it relates not just to our date paste, it relates also to our peanut butter, it even relates to applesauce, right? We're coming to Hanukkah. In Hanukkah, you have to have applesauce with your latkes. I don't know if it helps with the heartburn or not, but there are two types of applesauces. There's the chunky, retains the earlier bracha. Think of it as trima. The smooth applesauce would be a shahakol, okay? Now, there's a problem. Keep the trima in mind, and you will notice that it's not so simple due to the fact that there's a following statement. Whenever we talk about food travels from different regions. Okay, we all know that. We are blessed in this generation that you could open your cupboards and open your refrigerator and you could find Chilean fruit, Mexican fruit, Colombian fruit from Ecuador. All here, we are really, really lucky in our generation. In Talmudic times, perhaps only the wealthy would have the ability to enjoy imported goods. And there was an imported good that the Talmud discusses that originated in Hinduai, which is India. What was the food item they were discussing in Babylonia in the late 3rd, early 4th century that originated from India? So they talked about Hamilta or Hamalta, two ways of reading it, okay? And according to many authorities, this is actually ginger from India. And Rava tells us the following. Listen carefully. Rava tells us, although the ginger, when it would arrive in Babylonia, was pulverized. Nevertheless, the Hamelta de Atya that arrived, Mibei Handuai, from the Hindu India country, Boreh pri ha'adama, it retains its original blessing. So here we have a little bit of a problem. A minute ago, I mentioned that if I take my dates or my peanuts or my apples and I crush them and blend them and they no longer retain their original texture and form, shahakol. And Rava, regarding the ginger, says otherwise. How do we deal with this question? Now, by the way, this is halacha. Halacha tells us that if you have bisamim, some kind of spices, and they are shchukim, they are pulverized, and even if you added sugar to them to enhance their flavor, nevertheless, they retain their original bracha. So how do you deal with this contradiction? So the answer is, and this is what authorities go through after analyzing every single food that's mentioned in the Talmud, and they share with us the following rule, that when you have a food that the normal way of eating it is by processing it, so the bracha, the original bracha, is to be said after it is processed. For example, take potatoes. When you take potatoes out of the ground and you eat them raw, you're not going to make a borei pri adama. If somehow you make them edible, I don't know if it's possible, you will make a shahakol. Due to the fact that the normal way of eating a potato is by cooking it, the borei pri adama is said after it is cooked. Now, so too when it comes to the processing of any food, when it comes to the hamalta, when it comes to the ginger that in those days was exported from India to Babylonia, the normal way of eating it was when it was pulverized. So therefore, the bracha, the original bracha, the borei pri adama, is said on it when it is in that state. That is what we are told. On the other hand, when it comes to the dates, right, to the trima, when it comes to my peanuts, you can't tell me that the normal way of eating peanuts is peanut butter. Yes, a significant percentage goes to peanut butter, but people still eat peanuts and people eat chunky peanut butter. So therefore, when it is processed and it loses its original texture, it is a shakol. Okay? So too when it comes to the dates. Okay, the dates. When the dates are completely crushed, they lose their texture. It is not its original way or proper way or normal way of eating it. It becomes a shakol. So remember this idea. Hamalta, why does it retain the borei pri adama? Darko bekach. That is the normal way of eating it. On the other hand, why does the trima lose its blessing when it's processed? En darko bekach. That's not the normal way of eating it. So going back to the tea, why did Rabbi Shmuel Shoten and why did Rabbi Meir Eisenstadt really believe that it should be a borei pri hadama? How do you consume tea leaves? People in general don't chew on them. Rather, when they are grown and picked and transported, it is to get them into your cup of tea. That is the normal way of eating it. And by the way, just as you take vegetables that are made for cooking, even the water, even the liquids that they are cooked with, gain the same blessing as the item itself, right? The halacha tells us that if you cook vegetables and the soup has the full flavor of the vegetable, perhaps squash or zucchini, a squash zucchini soup, right? At home we get a very good one. So the soup itself is a borei pri adama because that is obviously the way it is eaten. So too, they argue would be with the tea. It was a fascinating minority opinion that has been rejected. I rejected it 35 minutes ago when I made my shakol on my cup of tea here. But nevertheless, it indicates that there's a lot of effort and a lot of analysis that has to go in to the food and understand where it comes from. So, by the way, there's even a discussion about beer. Why is it not a borei minei mezonot? Well, not our main discussion. However, now I would like to get to some interesting foods and debates that related to them. As the Crusades returned from the Holy Land to Europe, they obviously interacted with Islamic culture, which obviously was far more advanced than the Europeans. I mean, Europeans, what the Rambam writes about France, he calls it a country where people, live among pigs. It was not exactly a developed location at that point when it comes to the 11th and 12th century. So culture was actually imported a little bit from Arab countries, and so too foods that the Arabs managed to import from India and China made its way into Europe. And one of those items was the sweet salt. Sweet salt, we know that as sugar. Now, by the way, using the term sweet salt was something that made its way into halachic literature as well. And they used to call sugar zise salz, to such an extent that there was one authority who was asked the question that there was a community that ran out of salt and they needed to salt their chickens to make them kosher. And the question was, can we use sugar? And his response was, and this is a minority opinion that obviously did not know the reality, that since basically sugar is salt, but it happens to be sweet, so therefore you could use the sugar to kosher your chicken. Minority opinion rejected, but obviously the names could create a problem when you don't know where it comes from. Zise, sweet salt. So the Crusaders introduce it, and it comes to European countries. Obviously, only the wealthy could enjoy it, and it's a very, very popular item. Eventually, as the New World is discovered, so you have the sugar mills in the Caribbeans, and obviously the English control those routes. We're all familiar with the fact that they needed labor in the Americas, so they imported labor from Africa, also known as the slave trade. Okay, these are things we are familiar with a little bit. Now, when it comes, by the way, to the sugar that was being shipped back to Europe from the New World, halachic literature is aware of the fact that empty barrels were shipped from Europe, from Hamburg, from Amsterdam to the New World, and these barrels came back with sugar. But at times, the barrels that were shipped down into the Americas were with European goods, and at times it was flour and grain. So they had a situation where you would have barrels that started off with grain, sent to the Americas, and then refilled with sugar. And the halachic issue related to Pesach, the Noda B'Yehuda notes that there are those who are concerned when it comes to pulverized sugar for two problems. Problem number one has to do with the equipment that was used to originally, the barrels that originated in Europe had in it flour. And issue number two is that sometimes when the sugar would come to the ports in Amsterdam and in Hamburg, the merchants realized that the sugar is extremely expensive. Flour was cheap. So if they add 5 to 10%, and they wouldn't put a label, as you would see in a gas station, that is 5% ethanol, but rather they would just market it as sugar. So the sugar industry was one that rabbinic authorities were extremely familiar with. And now comes the question, what bracha do you make on sugar? What bracha do you make on sugar? So the Rambam talks about it. And the Rambam talks about the kanim, stalks, which are metukim, and they are sweet. And the Rambam shares with us three opinions. And he says the following. Kol hageonim, he starts off by saying that all the great rabbinic figures of the past, he actually only means the majority, were of the opinion that sugar canes and the juice that comes out of it, and eventually the sugar itself, is a boreh pri ha'adama. It is the fruits of the ground. Just as you would make on a tomato, you're going to go ahead and make a boreh pri ha'adama on your sugar. But then he notes that there is a minority among those great earlier authorities who say that it is a boreh priya etz. They're not annuals. These are stalks that seem to grow according to their understanding from a root that is, or even from a tree that redevelops every year. So they are perennials, and therefore it's a boreh priya etz. And the Rambam says, let me tell you what I think. Rambam says, I hear what these great rabbis say. I personally am of the opinion that the bracha is shehakol niya bidvaro. Ve'ani omer shehakol. That's what the Rambam tells us. Now, the Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim, who were moving on to an Ashkenazi authority a few hundred years later, he asked the following question on the Rambam. Now, why does the Rambam think that here you have a substance that originates from a tree, but nevertheless it is only shakol? Why it is so? So most probably, he writes, that the Rambam compares it to dvash tmarim. You know that there's a popular item now called silan, which is basically, I don't know exactly about the processing, but it's extracted, or perhaps actual dates, but it is what our rabbis call a honey that originates from a date. Silan, you cannot identify the structure of the fruit, and therefore the bracha would be shahakol. And it appears, writes Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim in Spain in the beginning of the 14th century, it appears that Maimonides views sugar, even though it originates from a plant, he views it just the same as the dvash marim, the honey of the dates. But Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim says there's a major difference between them, because when a person plants a palm tree, he's interested in the fruit. So that is the main way how it is consumed. On the other hand, when it comes to the kanim metukim, when it comes to the sugar canes, when they go ahead and plant them, no one is sucking and eating them. The whole production is just for the sake of the sugar. So if so, the sugar is the main product. So the Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim looks at sugar the same way the rabbis in the Talmud looked at pulverized ginger and believed that it should be a boreh priya adama. Okay, that's what he notes. And not that I want to make it too complex, Rabbi Yosef Karo says that again. He says, Rabbi Yosef Karo, a generation later, writes regarding this statement, and he says, I'm sorry, Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim was never in Egypt. Because in Egypt, many, thousands upon thousands of people suck on sugar cane. And due to the fact that they suck on sugar cane, don't tell me that it is only produced for the sugar. It is also produced for the tree itself. And he defends Maimonides that tells us to make a shahakol. Bottom line is, we all know that we make a shahakol on sugar. Not that I recommend eating it straight. I think for kids, it was popular to go out and eat sugar. They used to have sugar on a string, as some of us do remember. But the shakol became the given blessing. But then something fascinating changed, and the saintly Chafetz Chaim, we always talk about the Chafetz Chaim and his righteousness and the awareness we have today not to talk Lashon Hara originates really, and the credit goes to the saintly Chafetz Chaim. A few years ago, they discovered some footage of the Chafetz Chaim from a movie. There was such excitement because here's the tzaddik of all times, right? The great tzaddik, the Chafetz Chaim. So for many, he is the symbol of a tzaddik, but at the same time, he had tremendous knowledge in Torah in great depth. And he analyzed halachic issues by knowing the reality. And I'm going to prove it to you from the following discussion. Because remember, we walked away with the practice of following Maimonides. Sugar, if you, for whatever reason, not that I would recommend it and for sure wouldn't do it, eat a spoonful of sugar, it is clearly a shahakol nihiya bidvaro, no question about it. Now, in the beginning of the 19th century, there was a British blockade on ships to France from the New World. And as a result, there was no sugar available. Sugar was coming at that time from the Caribbean, from the New World, from Cuba, from the Dominican Republic. And due to the blockade, no sugar at all in France. And it was a crisis, a serious crisis. So a few French, this I think is 1811, a few French scientists present to Napoleon two loaves, sugar loaves, that were made from sugar beets. In other words, the beets themselves, there's a different type that is white, and they're known as sugar beets. They were grown mainly in Poland, and they were used as food for animals. However, these scientists, and this is already in the 18th century, discovered that they have a tremendous amount of sucrose in them. So they process them in a way that's a little bit different than sugar cane, but the similarity is that they are cut, they're soaked, they're boiled in water, the water gets the sugar. When you go ahead and dehydrate it, you somehow are able to get the pulverized sugar from it. Napoleon was extremely excited, and within a few short years, some 79,000 acres were designated for sugar beets. And in Europe and in North America too, a very significant percentage of our sugar is not from sugar cane, but rather from the sugar beets. Now, comes Rab Yisrael Meir HaKohen, the saintly Chafetz Chaim, and he says the following, although we have defended and we have the minhag of following the opinion of Maimonides of the Rambam, that we make sha'akol on sugar, but when it comes to the tzukar shelanu, when it comes to our sugar, it is made from borikes. So I looked up in Polish, beets, sugar beets, or perhaps all beets, are buraki. And Chafetz Chaim is aware of the fact that times have changed. And perhaps the sugar of Maimonides was a shakol, but nowadays, let's think about it. When they plant in the fields, in the thousands and thousands of fields, when they plant these beets, they are planted to produce sugar for no other reason. So therefore, he deeply feels that they should be sugar that originates from sugar beets, borei pri adama. Chafetz Chaim notes that you should know, I respect minhag ha'olam, the nahagu, nevertheless, people still make a shahakol. And this is an idea that's very important. We're going to find another such case, that when great rabbis, even though halachically it appears to them that it is one bracha, if everyone in the Jewish world does it otherwise, they step back and they say, you know what? It's as if it is the will of the Almighty that it is done that way. We're going to respect minhag ha'olam. It's a respect to Klal Yisrael, respect to what is being done, and therefore agreeing with the minhag. So this is what the Chafetz Chaim did. What's fascinating is his knowledge and understanding of the reality of the process, and therefore able to give us his psak. Now, our next brief discussion that relates to Brachot has to do with what's called chocolati. When you look at Shulchan Aruch, one of the popular commentators was Sha'arei Tshuva. He was a rabbi, a Galician rabbi, early 19th century, B'Ephraim Zalman Margaliot. And he talks about chocolati, and he gives us the bottom line, meaning he doesn't share with us the major debate and discussion that related to it, but he writes that chocolati, and we're going to translate that soon, chocolati is a shahakol. That's what he tells us. Now, the story behind it, there's a little bit of a story behind it, what we are talking about exactly. So, if you ever visit the city of Ferrara in Italy, there's a piazzetta there that's named in honor of Isacco Lampronti. Okay, Piazzetta, I haven't been there. I don't know if I've been to, I haven't been in Italy at all, but there is a Piazzetta Isacco Lampronti. And it is a Piazzetta that is named in honor of the great Rav Yitzchak Chizkia Lampronti. He was a Torah scholar and really the first one to put out like an encyclopedia, a halachic encyclopedia. He corresponds with the great rabbis of that time, especially Italian ones. And when he talks about a specific issue, he really shares with us all the information he has. And there are several pages that talk about the gicoletta. What is a gicoletta? The gicoletta was a chocolate drink that originated in Mexico. The Mexicans, or I should say the Aztecs, really enjoyed it. It was the beverage of the gods. And it appears that when Cortez, who gets credit for bringing to Europe many of the goods of the New World, among them tomatoes, right? When Cortez visited Montezuma in the Yucatan Peninsula, he was honored with the gicoletta, which was a chocolate drink. It had crushed chocolate beans in it. I think it also had some peppers, and it was considered the way to honor someone. Obviously, Cortez brought some back to Europe, and over the next century, it becomes a beverage and the beverage of the rich. So when Rabbi Lampronti has a halachic discussion regarding the gicoletta, he decides to share with us a little bit of the recipe, a recipe that you need to make a good gicoletta. So he notes the following, that taniach bekli shel gicoletta, of this chocolate, shnei litrin mei be'er, so 2 liters of well water, but it should be clean, hard to get in those days. And then you put it on the fire, and then you put in arba inkain, 4 ounces shell of the coccolate tova. Also put in some tsikari, so it's either sugar or chicory, corresponding to the arba unkion, corresponding to the 4 ounces. And then he tells us to cover it. And then he notes that it foams on top. It creates a ketzef, a foam, and he translated it as askrima, like a cream. At the end, he tells us that some have the minhag to add to their gicoletta chelmon beitza, the egg yolk, achat o shtaim, 1 or 2, and as a result, it foams even more. This is what he tells us about the gicoletta. So the question in halacha was, what bracha do you make on it? Because in some ways, these beans are grown for this beverage. On the other hand, it is liquidy. It's a liquid. Perhaps it is only infusing flavor into some water, and it's a shahakol. So there's a great debate regarding this matter. And bottom line is, it seemed to be, and this is what Sharei Tshuva tells us, the bracha is going to be a shahakol. All is fine. It's interesting that the great Rab Chaim Yosef David Azulai, who was one of the great scholars, lived in Hebron and was sent by the Hebron community for fundraising throughout European communities, and kept a diary about his actions, about his travels. And in his diary, he notes twice that he came to a specific community and they honored him there. So this is around 1760. They honored him there with a drink of gicolati. So that was like the way, you hit it big. If you get some hot chocolate from someone, that's a sign that, you've done very, very well. Now, as a result of the fact that in Shulchan Aruch it is printed, for gicolati it is shahakol, we've continued to make shahakol on gicolati. The problem is something significant changed about 170 years ago. Joseph Fry and then John Cadbury, it appears were the first to go ahead and no longer push for people to be drinking chocolate, but rather to be eating chocolate. Chocolate bars were created. When you create a chocolate bar, the main ingredient is obviously the cocoa bean. Yes, some ingredients are added, but that is only to enhance the cocoa bean. So therefore, it has been argued by many, yes, when the chocolate was a beverage and it was basically water that was flavored, it makes sense to make a shako. But now that you eat it as a food, and we all agree that the beans, right, are harvested, the beans are grown with the intention and the normal way to make them and to consume them is in a bar, they should be similar to the ginger of Talmudic times. And just as the ginger retained their original bracha, the chocolate of today should actually be borei peri ha'etz. This is a question that was asked, and many great scholars struggled with it. And the most honest of all, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says you should know that I personally think that technically speaking, a chocolate should be a borei peri ha'etz for that reason. It is the way you consume the fruit of that tree, of the cocoa tree, is by making it into a bar. And since that is the way you consume it, the borei peri ha'etz should be made. But he notes that due to the fact that it has been printed that on chocolate you make a shakol, even though that statement was made for a beverage, people applied it to the solid bar as well. And it became minhag ha'olam, it became the custom of the world. You simply can't change it. And we have to respect, if the Jewish people make a shakol, and every Jewish child knows you make a shakol on a piece of chocolate, that is what we're going to do. Respecting the minhag is something that is very significant in our tradition. You know, knowing reality is important. And I'll share with you, and this is really to end our brief discussion of a major area in Jewish law. We've been privileged, and in this generation, many children in school have their brachos be, that they get tested and they become familiar. And there are complexities due to the fact that different foods are processed in different ways. Believe it or not, that when it comes to a food like cornflakes, some manufacturers of cornflakes actually are going to be a shakol and some are borei peri adama. It's a complex area in Jewish law. This is only a taste of the complexities of brachot. But we're going to end off with a story. And this is a story I heard in Memphis. And one Shabbos in Memphis, this probably goes back some 15 years ago, 16 years ago, we had a guest. A very special Jew from Yerushalayim. His name was Rabbi Yaakov Uri. Rabbi Yaakov Uri. Rabbi Yaakov Uri is a hardworking individual, very committed to Torah and to Klal Yisrael. And he actually owns a pizza store. He was the first one to have a pizza store in the Haredi neighborhoods in Yerushalayim. It's called Pizza Uri. It's right by Kikar Shabbos. And the reason Rabbi Yaakov Uri was in Memphis was not to promote pizza, but rather to try to purchase another motorcycle for Zaka. What is that? Unfortunately, you do remember 20 years ago the terrible bombings by the Oslo tragedies that we faced in Eretz Yisrael at that time. And there was a group of committed Hasidic Yidden who did everything possible that after a bombing in Nebach, there were body parts everywhere, to bring every single part to Kever Yisrael to proper burial. These are righteous tzaddikim that are very, very inspiring. Now, they had their motorcycles. When they would hear of a bombing, they would go with motorcycles. And the reason they would go with motorcycles was simply because they realized that in Jerusalem traffic, you could get to places faster. Now, as they would get there, at times they realized that they would get there before the ambulances. So immediately Yaakov Uri said to himself, you know what, this is not normal. If we're getting there so fast, we should be sure that we should be training them in first aid. So Zaka, we're not just taking care of Kavod Ames, but trying to save lives as well. And he noted to Magena David Adom that I think it's absurd, right? He had a good relationship with them at the time. And he says, I think it's absurd that I could deliver a pizza faster than your ambulances are getting to a place where they are needed due to the traffic. So he made it his goal to equip all of his motorcycles with life-saving equipment, training the drivers, and yes, buying motorcycles. And in Memphis itself, we got together money and we actually sponsored a Memphis motorcycle for Zaka. So he was a very inspiring individual to have in shul. We really enjoyed it. We schmoozed with him. And then he shared with me a story that related to his pizza store. And it works as follows. One of the great halachic debates when it comes to brachot has to do with the proper bracha on pizza. And there is a level of complexities for two reasons. Number one, how do you view it? Is it a mizonot or a hamotzi? Meaning, when you have bread and you put on some bread, some cheese, it is bread with cheese, it's hamotzi. But when you, on the other hand, have some dough and bake with it flavors, and the flavors penetrate the dough, it is no longer a bread. We view it as a snack, a mezonot. How do we view pizza? And obviously, it's an extended and very significant discussion among authorities. And issue number two has to do with the fact that even if you identify it as a mezonot, if you eat a significant amount and make it into a meal, you've upgraded into a motzi. So therefore, there's this discussion, what bracha do you make on pizza? Many people have the practice, if it is one slice, you only make a mezonot. If it's two, perhaps a motzi. The truth is, it really depends if you're making a meal out of it or not. In Yerushalayim, the Badats, which gave him the hashkacha, were of the opinion that your pizza, due to the fact that your dough is really a bread dough, even one slice is hamotzi, unless the dough is baked with a liquid that has a good flavor and has an intense flavor like apple juice, because then the dough becomes a sweet dough, and then it is more like a cake and it will be a borem mine mezonot. That was the opinion of the Badats. So they basically were coming into Uri's Pizza in its early days to try to figure out what liquid is used in the dough to determine the bracha on a slice of pizza. So they come in and they're ready to have that discussion. If it is water, they're going to paskin it's hamotzi. If it is apple juice, like others do, it's going to be a borem mine mezonos. They speak to Rabbi Yaakov Uri, and Rabbi Yaakov Uri said to them, listen, I got training for this pizza in Italy. I follow the minhag of whatever shtetl in Italy I went to make it, and they actually use milk. They use milk in the dough. I don't know if he still does that, but they were using milk. Could be because in Israel subsidized, he was able to do so. So the rabbis of the Badats have a discussion and a debate, and they start asking and questioning, and they say to him, we are of the opinion that milk does not give a flavor. It is like water, and we're planning to paskin and put up a sign in your store that it is hamotzi. Yaakov Uri argues, and he says, listen, don't tell me about flavors. Milk does give flavor, and therefore I think it's a mezonot. Okay, as the debate continues, Rav Yaakov Uri says to them, listen, you guys are sitting here for some time. Can I bring you some coffee? Yeah, of course. The rabbis, they're offered a cup of coffee. So he puts out 2 cups of coffee for the guests, and he puts one for himself, and he pours milk into his own coffee and doesn't offer them milk. And he realizes that they're looking and waiting to be offered some milk to add to their coffee. And he says to them, oh, you guys want milk in your coffee? For what reason? And they said, well, you add milk to coffee. They weren't sure what he's trying to get. You add milk to coffee, it gives it a better flavor. So Rav Yaakov Uri says, oh, so you think that milk can enhance or change the flavor of a substance? And they said, yes. And then they realized that they got their answer. And Rav Yaakov Uri says, and since then, there's a big sign in my pizza shop that on a slice of pizza, if you don't make a meal out of it, it is borem mine mezonot, because the milk does give it flavor. So he shared the story with great pride, and a very fascinating individual, but obviously it tells us that this is a fascinating topic, and highly, we encourage all always. Brachot is an area that we can always, become more familiar with. all of us, because there's so much of it. And it is a way to show our appreciation for the many good things we have in this world. We always talk about the fact that the gifts that the Almighty has given us, especially in this era, when you have access to so many wonderful foods, are ones that should be appreciated with those brachot. And let's do our part in making them and saying them and being grateful. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, Mike and Marcia. And may the study of Torah, which we did a little bit of it tonight, be a schus for the neshama of your mother, of Mike's mother, Tzipra Ruchel Bas Avram Eliezer. And we thank everyone for joining. We're going to go ahead and see